Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and today I'm joined by Christopher Ruocchio, author of the Sun Eater series. And Christopher, a little birdie told me, and by that I mean this is publicly available knowledge, the seventh and final book is going to be coming out this November. How does that feel?
It's this is always a bit of a downer answer, but it feels kind of sad mostly for me personally. I'm very excited for everybody to read the book, but like I've been working on the series in some form or other since I was a kid, and for it to be done, the analogy I've been using is it's like I've had an alien relative who has consumed so much of my focus and attention for so many years, who is now gone, and I just kind of am wandering around bereft. Bereft is the word that I've been using a lot. I am already working on the next thing, however, which is somewhat interfering with that mood. But it's sort of a complicated place to be psychologically. That said, it's out in almost exactly 2 months. It's out on November the 18th. Shadows Upon Time. You can pre-order it wherever books are sold, wherever you would like. If you would like to get them signed, you can pre-order them from Quail Ridge Books at quailridgebooks.com. They will ship to you wherever you are, as long as you're willing to, foot the postage. But we'll send it to you. And yeah, no, I'm very excited for people to see how it is. I'm mostly excited to see if I stuck the landing, because of course I love it, but whether or not you all will is something I will only be able to see in time. And in a certain sense, you only really understand what it is you've written until other people have experienced it. So I'm looking forward to that. So
Well,
two
I'm
months.
looking forward to it as well. I'm all in on the Sun Eater journey. 6 books in, one to go. And while it might be like losing a grandma. When writing a series, you can just write yourself a new grandma. So I think you'll be
True.
I think you'll be all right with your post series grief. I don't know if I'm going to be all right with the post series grief, depending on how the series ends. The last some of the books in Sun Eater are a bit of an emotional gut punch. I don't know how many more of those I can take, Mister Ruocchio. So I'll check back in with you in a in a couple of months.
Well, we got one more round in the ring. We'll see how it goes. If you can keep you all on your feet or not.
All right, fingers crossed. So listen, guys, I'm a sci-fi guy. Sci-fi is the best fi. And we're going to be talking about science fiction and fantasy today. And so I thought, who better than someone that kind of writes in that science fantasy, sword and planet, space opera, bit of science fiction, bit of fantasy type genre to kind of provide some insight into these genres and maybe see if we can find maybe like a little bit of a middle ground between these, or whether we are destined to be enemies. So my first question for you, Christopher, is do you think that science fiction and fantasy are enemies, in the sense that if one gains more popularity, it's a zero-sum game, so the other one has to come down, vice versa, sci-fi goes up, fantasy comes down? Or do you think they're really allies, that as the popularity of, say, fantasy grows, that science fiction can grow as well, and they can work together as a team?
I really do think it's mostly a beneficial relationship. Fantasy is and has always been the larger genre in terms of overall readership. There are a lot of reasons why that's the case. I think my personal theory is that sort of the grammar of fantasy is more accessible to most people, right? Knights, castles, dragons. People know what a lot of that stuff is, especially now. But even in like 1950, right? People knew what that stuff was. An elf you might have to work a little bit harder on, right? An orc was new, right? But knights, castles, dragons, a lot of that stuff sort of baked in a way that, like, if you're a science fiction writer, you make up a novel alien, you have to explain everything about that alien, right? Unless it's a Vulcan, in which case, like, is it just an elf? I'm not sure. But I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's just the ears. But completely different. In any case, I think that fantasy has largely served. This has been true of me, at least as far as reading goes, as sort of more of an entrepot to reading speculative fiction generally. A lot of people's first books, fantasy science fiction, tend to be Harry Potter or The Hobbit or something like that, and they'll go from there, and then eventually sort of make the jump into science fiction. Now, there are people for whom that's not true, but I think that that story is more common than I picked up an H.G. Wells book, or I picked up Isaac Asimov, or I picked up whatever, right? I think that you come to science fiction probably a bit later, and at least most of us do. And I found that this has been true with my own readers, because a lot of people will say they are only fantasy readers, and they're going to
Mm.
take a shot at my series because it was sort of in the interstice. We sort of packaged it like a fantasy series. The covers are more fantasy than sci-fi. I tried really hard to get them to say fantasy on the spine, to treat it as fantasy, for the foot traffic in Barnes and Noble, but that didn't quite happen. In any case, it's been a lot more common for me to get that story than for me to get hard science fiction readers who are real jazzed about what it is I'm doing. More often, it is the case with the hard science fiction readers. They'll come in and they will have expected something a little bit more that. And they're like, "You're not Alistair Reynolds," and I couldn't even try to be Alistair Reynolds. That guy is a genius. I'm just me. And so I think that largely fantasy serves to sort of usher new readers into science fiction um, than the reverse. But I think that it's a more beneficial relationship overall, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure there definitely is YA sci-fi, but I don't think there's, sci-fi series that have like popped off the same way that fantasy has. So perhaps that it is a bit of an easier intro into the genre, and that kind of has like rippling effects throughout your reading life, your reading career. I would agree. I feel like in terms of the industry, and you've worked in publishing as well, so you can maybe provide some insights here. I feel like some resources are limited and some resources are a little bit more elastic. And what I mean by that is a publisher can only publish so many books. A publisher can only spend so much on marketing when it comes to like adaptations. The film studios can only, produce so many films. And so maybe if that means fantasy is having its moment, which it seems to be this centrally relative to sci-fi, perhaps that is a bit less funds being put into science fiction. But I feel like readers, while they don't have an infinite amount of time, there's only 24 hours in a day, I feel like reading sparks a love for more reading. And you mentioned that, fantasy people have come to Sun Eater. I've had a lot of fantasy people come to me and said, I started to get into reading again in my 20s or 30s or whatever it was. And I've been reading a lot of fantasy. And that made me want to pick up more science fiction. And that's how I found you and your channel. So I think the two can work together. It might not be, there might be a finite amount to which that they can both go up at the same time. But I do think that the two can work hand in hand.
Yeah, 100%. I do think that science fiction has always been sort of the inferior partner in that relationship. It's the smaller of the two camps, basically. And I do think too that this may be a consequence of sort of the genesis of the two genres as sort of commercial movements. Science fiction started out more with it started out really exclusively with the pulp magazines, right? Whereas fantasy, yes, had a place in the pulp magazines and just as great a place, and maybe greater. It did have prestige novels pretty early on. Lord of the Rings is pretty early, relatively speaking, but there are, and it's of course huge. But there's, the Worm, Ouroboros, there's Gormenghast, there's earlier stuff. There's Lord Dunsany, right? And that had more of a sort of maybe upper class reputation, and consequently more of a big publishing reputation, right? The famous story with Tolkien, right, is he did not want there to be a mass market paperback of his work in America because he was better than mass market paperbacks, and so Donald Wollheim sort of exploited a loophole, let's say, in copyright law and published some unauthorized versions, and it is those versions that got very popular with like the Zeppelin hippie crowd, right? But there was a
Interesting.
sense on Tolkien's part that like whole printing it was beneath him, right? He was an Oxford guy, right? And so I think that there is a bit more of a literary commercial prestige associated to fantasy early on, and this changed. I mean, pretty dramatically, moving into the '60s and '70s when everything kind of got pulped, and you see Del Rey's influence on the field with Shara and all these things, and so I think that sort of democratized leading into the '90s and Wheel of Time and all this stuff. But I do think early on, um, fantasy had a bit more of an academic reputation. I think there are probably people who quibble with that, but this is a relative statement, right, compared to science fiction. Whereas Gernsback was trying really, really hard to legitimate his writing in the eyes of parents buying the magazines for their children, right? This guy is a PhD. It's in entomology. It's not related to, what he's writing about, but like he's a doctor, we promise, right? And but I do think, just as a consequence of science fiction being exclusively for a little while there a pulp fiction medium, right, and short stories more than novels too. I think that science fiction has always sort of lagged behind in terms of broad appeal. Um, but I don't think that's the only reason. I think fantasy maybe just is more broadly appealing for the reason I already said. Um, I think it's just more accessible, sort of tropically, grammatically, in a sense, right? Whereas science fiction is a little bit hard. I think science fiction has a reputation for being harder too, just because you have to. The impression is that you have to know some science, right? And with some writers, that's true. Other writers are better at either holding your hand or are better at integrating the science or are able to do something a little bit smoother for reader experience than just sort of info dumping quantum theory at you.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, no, no. I mean, it just simply is the case that science fiction is a smaller market. But I do think you're right. I think that readers read, and that readers beget more readers, and that fantasy largely has served to steward and handmade speculative fiction reading, and science fiction reading particularly. So I think it's a good thing. I'm rambling, but
Yeah.
here we are. Oh.
No, it's interesting. The origin of the genres with science fiction starting mostly through magazines and shorts, you can kind of see how that influenced the style with a lot of the science fiction being written focusing on the ideas, partially just because it was inspired by a scientific concept a lot of the time, but also because of the format, right? You don't have time to flesh out characters and do all this like world building and stuff, in a 20-page short story. So the focus on the ideas has sort of stayed throughout science fiction, whereas fantasy, which perhaps was tied to novels earlier on in its genesis, fantasy. That's why there's so many fantasy series, right? There's so much that fantasy authors want to tell us. They build this epic world. They've got their magic system, the characters, the history, the lore, and so that kind of the two different styles. One lent itself to novels perhaps earlier on, was maybe considered more literary and for a while, not many science fiction books were like even published at novels really until like the 50s. Before that, it was mostly the magazines. So that might have informed the style and the perception by the readers. Not me though. I'm a sci-fi guy. I like the concept-driven stuff. So, Christopher, to someone that is maybe leaning more towards science fiction like me, or maybe someone that leans more towards fantasy like another reader, is science fantasy the middle ground? Is this the kind of hybrid genre that could bring us together? What would be your pitch to someone like me to open my reading scope with science fantasy?
Okay, so what I would say first is that even though the two genres have sort of were generated separately, right, and they have sort of separate histories that kind of run parallel, in a sense they are the same thing, right? Because what they are, right, is the literature of the imagination, right? Whether that is speculative or imaginative, right? What we are doing is we are imagining a world that is different from ours, right? That has different rules, right, and is in contact with ours in different ways, right? The language of mythology, of symbolism, right, is still present in science fiction, right? What is an alien, sort of archetypically, right, is not that different a question from what is a dragon, right? Now the answers are a little bit different, but that question is useful, and the answers are where the story is, right? And so the question that science fiction readers, I think, need to ask about fantasy is, why do I care about these questions, right? And the answer, I think, is that the reason fantasy is so appealing, or should be so appealing, is that it concretizes a lot of this symbolic language, right, that we use to think about reality. People do think about, the challenges they face in terms of monsters and dragons and vampires or whatever, right? We do all imagine ourselves a hero or a knight at times, right? Or in need of rescue, or the villain, right? And these are still the questions that really undergird science fiction, right? There are questions about the great unknown and adventure and man's pursuit of knowledge and the consequences of man's pursuit for knowledge, right? There's not a huge difference between the mad scientist and Faust, right?
Mm.
And it's really that underlying human narrative that is story in the first place, because we tell stories about people, right? Even if it is concept driven, right? The story, the drama comes in humanity's response to those questions, those concepts, right? Or the robots questions, right? Or whatever, because the robots too can be a useful foil, right? The aliens can be a useful foil for what humanity is, but ultimately the story needs to be about the relationship between human consciousness and reality, right? And fantasy concretizes a lot of that symbolic language. There's a famous story about Tolkien, right, going to see Macbeth, and at the end of Macbeth, right, they're all they cut down Burnham Wood, and they're moving the forest towards Dunsinane Hill, right? And so
Apologies
the
for Macbeth
prophecy is,
spoilers, everybody.
yeah, it's if you don't know, it's too late. Right? And Tolkien was like, it would be better if the trees actually moved, though, and it wasn't just a trick, right? And in a sense, right, that is the sort of feeling that's under fantasy, right? It's like, let's actually make that real, right? The trees can actually move, right? Magic's real. It's not a symbolic dragon. It's not Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, where it's a serial killer. It's really a dragon. Wouldn't that be a better story in a sense, right? And that's sort of the ethic of fantasy, and that's not that different, right, from the questions we as science fiction writers ask when we're imagining the future or some technologic scenario. It's just that the furniture, right, the forms that those ideas embody, right, in like a platonic sense, are different, right? So like you can tell the same story and have it be about a mad scientist and a virus, right, or a quantum reality, influencing machine, and a dragon and a wizard that like does a weird thing, right? And so really, if you are interested in those questions about like fundamental sort of human nature, consciousness, relationship to reality, either genre addresses those in different ways, and I don't think that the ways are even that different. I think that um, the enterprise that we undertake in world building in science fiction is not that different from fantasy, because we have to ask a lot of the same questions, and I think this is increasingly true, right? As people like, when people make, most modern fantasy really is science fiction in the sense that the magic and the supernatural of that world is generated in a materialist way, is scientific, right? Most magic systems, so called, are just novel forms of physics. They're just not real.
Mm.
Um, and I find that mostly less appealing, actually, because it's not applicable in a way that a question of like, how do you overcome a dragon, right, in terms of personal growth is applicable, right? But like, we can get there. The point is the genres are kind of converging anyway. A lot of modern fantasy, I think, is um, functionally science fiction, because its questions are, uh, about energy anyway. How does a wizard cast a spell? Not what does a spell mean, right? And that can just be fun. There is something entertaining about trying to figure out how the magic works, so that you can almost solve the mystery of the story, right? In the same way that you like solving a whodunit murder, right? So there are, I think, ways for the technically minded, right, and for people who enjoy the technically minded stuff in science fiction to enjoy that about modern fantasy. But I think these deeper questions are the same. And if the answers, right, have an impact on your real life, I think you could be as moved by that in science fiction as in fantasy.
That's interesting that there can be sort of like a sci-fi approach to fantasy, that the magic system, or something else that's fantastical about your worlds, can have like a mathematical or physics based rule system or approach to it. As someone that's in the sci-fi space, that sometimes hears people say, this is just fantasy in space, or fantasy on a spaceship. Uh, I wonder if there are people in the fantasy space that are saying, oh, this is just sci-fi in medieval Europe or something like. I wonder if that is that version for fantasy readers.
That guy's got to be out there. I haven't
Yeah.
heard that as much, right? And I do think that this is because so I've gotten this criticism, right? Sun Eater acknowledges science, let's say, but like I'm not afraid to sort of bend the rules and tell the story that I want to tell, right? And to touch on mythology and history in ways that I think is appealing to me as an artist, and I hope is appealing to my readers. Um, but there are people who just like really, really wish that it was a hard science fiction series, and I get that, and I think that there is a camp of really dedicated science fiction reader who doesn't want to read anything that is not that. I've found that that sort of, I don't want to say puritanism because that has too many, but it's about the right word. I have not so much found coming from the other direction. I'm sure there is that. I'm sure there are people who, they can't abide reading science fiction, right? But I've mostly found that the people who don't want to read science fiction don't do so because they have a prejudice against it. It's they either feel unqualified or disinterested. Whereas I have encountered a lot of hard sci-fi readers who are like, "This isn't hard sci-fi, then it's crap." Um, and I totally get that, right? If that's your thing, again, Alistair Reynolds is a genius. Um, I don't have enough nice things to say about that guy. I am not, that kind of science fiction writer. But I really admire those science fiction writers. But I've always been trying to do my own sort of different thing, and but I do think that I do think there is a little sci-fi camp that's a lot more hardcore in particular. Um, and I don't know what the reason for that is. Maybe it's demography. I don't know, but uh, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like books should be judged on what they are as opposed to what we want them to be. Like if somebody
Sure.
read Sun Eater and their Goodreads review was, "This is no Alistair Reynolds, 1 star," I'd be like, well, that's not really what it's trying to be. I mean,
Yeah, it's not
if
a
you said,
cookbook either.
yeah,
Um, you know,
if someone said, Peter F. Hamilton, he's no Alistair Reynolds, 1 star, I'd be like, okay, kind of a mean review, but at least they're in the same like field, they have similar objectives, whereas, something that's like science fantasy might be going for something a bit different. So talking about genre definitions isn't the most fun thing to do, but I feel like it helps to get people on the same page. If with language, if we can understand what the words mean. So to you, does science fantasy mean that it is incorporating content in terms of like the rules, the systems, the actual things that happen within the world is what make it defines the genre, or is it the style and the tropes? So to split the two, for example, you might have a book that has like a science fiction setting. We're on a spaceship, but it focuses more on the characters, the hero's journey, the history, the philosophy, the maybe religious themes, things like that, things that we associate with fantasy. But there's no magic. Nothing happens in the series that is outside the realm of, known science or possible science. Would you consider that science fantasy because of the style and tropes, or do you think it's specifically the content? For something to be science fantasy, does it need some kind of wizard, magic, dragon, something that is, breaks sci-fi rules?
I incline towards the second camp. I really think if you're going to call something fantasy, that you need to earn it. I think that these sort of hard sci-fi purists that I'm talking about here would lean towards that first camp. But I think if a series is simply less interested in physics and engineering questions, right? So like I love Lois Bujold's Vorkosigan saga, right? She's not really interested in those questions, right? To the extent that she's interested in science questions, it's really about biology. There's a lot of stuff about human reproduction and sort of genetic modification and its impact on culture, right? It's a lot more soft science, and I think especially early Sun Eater inclines more in that camp. Later in the series, it does get a little bit more outrightly fantastic, and that was always the script. But I do think that it would be unfair, or at least incorrect, and it would be misleading to call Vorkosigan science fantasy, even though it reads like a fantasy novel. Really, what it reads like is like a sort of Regency romance, social comedy, actually, for a lot of it. But she's a lot more interested in sort of political institutions and character interaction than she is in engineering and stuff. But that's not to say it's not there. Um, I don't think it's fair to narrow science fiction into sort of the engineer hero stories of the Campbell era, right? Which is what Campbell was doing, right? One thing that we I think forget or don't think about is that for most of the genre's history up until the last couple of decades, because there was no independent publishing, it was really quite a small and narrow field. And there were only, maybe a couple dozen editors in the English language, right, at any given time. And in traditional publishing, that's still true. There are probably fewer than, maybe it's like half a hundred. It's more now, certainly. Um, but it was the case that the personal tastes of a couple of editors in the 50s, 60s, 70s were able to shape the entire genre, right? And we had a very
I bet they were
unified.
walking around conventions like kings. Look at
They
me,
were a
I
little bit, yeah,
the power, the literary
yeah,
power, Christopher.
yeah. I mean, there's a reason. If you think of science fiction, right? If you ask like your aunt about science fiction, she doesn't read any of it, right? And you say, don't think about Star Wars, don't think about Star Trek, right? She's thinking about finned rocket ships, right, and like little square-headed robots with Lego man hands, right? And that's analog of like the Campbell period, right? She's thinking about robot stories and like probably something she doesn't want to read, and there was a time when that was like all science fiction was that, right? And that creates
I
this
like
like
that your
incredible
hypothetical aunt was born in like 1912.
well, I what year is it? I don't know. Um
I feel like we're a
but
similar age, but you're an old soul. Anyway, maybe
yeah,
maybe your aunt, maybe your grandmother, but I get your point.
but if you control for the big film franchises, right? I think people's sort of general clip art sense of science fiction really is close to the analog vision, right? Because I think that casts such a long, I won't say dark shadow. I love a lot of that stuff. I mean, Dune was published in analog in this period, uh, but these editors were able to really crystallize their visions and to leave their mark on the genre for a really, really long time. And it is only in the sort of more recent period that things have really opened up and the genre has become whatever you really want it to be. And so, really, the thing is that you can find whatever you want to read in infinite supply at this point. The quality may vary, but like if you have a very particular flavor you want to imbibe, like you don't have to try anything else if you don't want to. And it, so there is that. Um, but I do think that properly speaking, if we're going to understand science fantasy, to sort of loop back, I think that it needs to contain the tropes of both science fiction and fantasy to some degree. Now, the underlying sort of explanation for these things can be different, right? Perns, dragons, or aliens, right? You might not have dragons at all. Your dragon could be metaphorical, but like the magic isn't. It doesn't matter, right? But like you need to have something that sort of a layman would recognize as a fantasy thing happening, and something that same layman would recognize as a science fiction thing happening, right? Um, you know, so I think um, you need some kind of supernatural thing, right? Or you need, uh, you know, uh, I don't know. You need a dragon. Dragons are hard in space. I'll say that. But like, or
Just
you
going nowhere.
have
Just
these
just
like deeply
just
medieval
stuck.
institutions. Yeah, they can't move. And fire doesn't work either. It's just terrible. Um, there's a there's a Bob Eggleton painting that was there's a copy of it hanging in a Crazy Fire Mongolian grill I went to once when I was in college. That was a dragon with a jetpack on, and I was like, there you go, that's the answer.
I
Um,
like it.
it was awesome. But in any case, yeah, so like I think you really need some of those things together, whether that's the sort of institutions of antiquity, castles and knights and kings and things. Dune, I think, gets there, right? Even though the supernatural stuff in Dune is explicable nominally, right? I don't know how the drug causes you to see space time, but like, okay, it does. That's fine, right? But at the same time, there are people who wanted to find Dune as purely science fiction, and I think that's reasonable. Um, the thing about science fantasy is that it is very hard to pin down exactly where the line is, but that's true of really anything. I think. You know, so I could keep rambling, but I feel like I should stop.
I would be inclined to agree with your assessment in terms of, so for example, maybe a series like Red Rising, someone might say, oh, this is fantasy or a science fantasy because it has a lot of fantasy tropes, it reads like fantasy, but I've only read the first three books, so maybe things change, but from memory, there's no magic, there's nothing that would break any sort of scientific rules. Not all the science is explained, but I would say everything is potentially possible, and therefore I would categorize it as science fiction. And maybe that's an honest assessment. Maybe that's just me being a little bit biased, trying to protect sci-fi, because when people say, "Oh, that's fantasy," or Dune's fantasy, Hyperion's fantasy, I'm like, guys, you've already got Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Stormlight, Game of Thrones. Like, let us have Dune. All right, we need Dune is
Right.
ours. I've got to fight for Dune. I'm going to put it under science fiction, science fantasy at most. I can't go to fantasy. I don't know what the explanation is, but I'll come up with the explanation for the spice, the worm. I'm sure there's some scientific explanation for the worm, Christopher.
Sure, sure. I think aliens probably created the sandworms actually, and we just never see them.
The
But we still don't know. You
smoking
never
laser
will.
gun right there.
Smoking lays gun, yes. I do think really the fundamental distinction, right? So when you're doing the world building, you're imagining either your fantasy setting or your science fiction setting. I think that the science fiction writer ultimately, the thing that distinguishes the science fiction writer from the fantasist, is that the science fiction writer is trying to stay within the realms of what is at least possible, right? Now that like we know nothing about what alien life might be like if it exists, we're still not 100%. It is possible that it doesn't, which is very interesting, right? And it's worth thinking about. But the point is that field is still very open, right? There's a lot of speculating about what is plausible that we can do that's not actually that narrowly confined, right? And fantasy writers don't care, right? At all, right? They're just like, I'm going to tell a story, right? Because I'm interested in doing this thing. I think that the best fantasy sort of gets at those sort of fundamental questions about meaning and an archetype, and doesn't just make up novel physics systems for the hell of it. But the science fiction writer is trying to speculate about what is possible, or at least to use something that is probable to commentate on what is, right? And so there is this sort of aspiration of staying within the guardrails of reality in science fiction that doesn't exist in fantasy. And I think that's ultimately the distinction. And it is for this reason I really, at the end of the day, think of what I'm doing as fantasy because that wasn't my primary concern. Now, I wanted to sort of take my fantasy concern and try to make it as plausible as possible. And maybe that's what makes me a science fantasy writer, right? The fundamental assumptions, right, about reality in Sun Eater are not ones that I'm trying to persuade you are plausible necessarily.
Hmm.
Do I think some of them are true? Like maybe, but I am more interested in telling that story and then bringing that story as close to plausible as possible than I am um, sort of trying to create something plausible from first principles. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think the science fiction writer tries to imagine some kind of future or past or parallel present or whatever, right? Um, whereas the fantasy writer imagines some other place.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit of a debate within science fiction as whether science fiction is supposed to be predictive or not. Is this a look at a potential future, or are we just using this as a setting to analyze our present? Science fiction is not about the future, it's about the now. And I actually don't think there's a correct answer to this. I think that's why when people say, "Oh, don't you get bored reading nothing but science fiction?" Well, there's so much science fiction from literary sci-fi to just strictly hard sci-fi. And for me, it's more about the author's intention and their execution. So if they want to use science fiction to try and predict the future. That's interesting to me. I'm interested about the future. If they want to use it to comment on something that's happening now, that's also potentially interesting to me. So I don't think that necessarily one is right or wrong. Maybe just as long as if you are dipping into the sci-fi tropes, the sci-fi aesthetic, there's at least some sort of like respect or understanding of the sci-fi that you're using. Like, I'm not super strict on getting everything right, but if it's like this didn't need to be a sci-fi story and maybe was even worse because it was a sci-fi story, then it might not work for me. But whether it's towards the softer end or the harder end, the I'm more just concerned with finding out what the author's objective is, and do they take me on an interesting journey is mostly what determines my enjoyment from the book.
Yeah, no, I think so too. There is the third camp, right? You can still do a sci-fi story and try neither to predict the future or comment on something, but you still try to speculate, right, about just to set up a scenario that relies upon technology within the bounds of what's plausible or at least imaginable, right? Without trying to say this is what I think is going to happen, right? Because there is an attitude that science fiction, right, is the author attempting to say this is how the future is going to be or should be, right? I get a lot of people who are real upset with me because I have monarchies in the future, and they're just like, "Would you want this to happen?" I'm like, "What kind of question even is that?" All right, I made up a setting where that is true. I am not saying that Sunnydar is real or should be real. I think it's interesting, right? And I hope that you do too, and I hope that you have a good time reading it. I am not, I'm not saying anything about whether or not there will be kings in the future. I have no idea. Um, there are still
Whoever
kings
whoever
now, so
whoever said that must not like dystopian books. You
yeah,
really want us to be spying on everybody? Like, this is
yeah,
what you
you
chose
really,
to write? This is your dream future? It's like, nobody said I want it to be this
yeah,
way.
they're like, well, I don't love Big Brother, you monster. There are people who I just am completely mystified by. But this is one thing, right? That I run afoul of this suspicion that science fiction ought to be aspirational or predictive. I think I blame Star Trek for this because that was like sort of the bespoke purpose of Star Trek was that it was aspirational in some sense. Um, I don't know how desirable that future really is, if only because people stopped wearing clothes that looked sensible. But I hate the Starfleet uniforms with a passion. But Star Trek's already wrong. We don't use flip phones anymore. Like it's not predictive. Um, it's it is. I think a fool's errand to try and really be predictive, outside of like certain sort of limited areas of expertise that any writer might have, whether that's technology or you know um, astrophysics or something. And there are reasons to do that, but to imagine as readers that science fiction writers are prophets is, I think, a grave mistake. We're entertainers, and now we're trying to entertain you by being intelligent and speculating about things. But like um, prophets, no. Um, and so I always try to caution my own readers against making that assumption. It is sufficient to entertain, and it's just a question of how. And all these different camps you might fall into, I think, are entertainingly valid, right? It's okay to try and speculate, right? It's okay to try and comment on the present. It's okay to do neither of those things. It's okay to just go write a fantasy novel where depending on what cheesy weight you can fly or not, like it's fine. As long as you're entertaining people, ultimately the art has the potential to be to have some merit. It's just a question of really what it is and whether or not there's an audience for it. I think. Now there are books that are maybe worse ideas than others, obviously, right? But I think that certainly any of these genres, or to attempt to write in any of these genres, or to do any of these things with these genres, I think is fine because I do think too that these genres really are. We think about them as boxes to put books into, but really what they are colors that
Hmm.
the artist can use to tell the story however they like. We spend so much time litigating whether or not a book is either science fiction or fantasy, or space opera, or hard science fiction, or cyberpunk, or whatever. And when I was writing Sunny, I'm like, this chapter is going to be a bit more cyberpunk, and then we're going to move away from that stuff. And you know, I I sort of use these things when it's appropriate, and to not feel sort of trapped, and to leave my readers to determine what exactly it is I've done to themselves. Because really, what matters to most people, right, is is it science fiction or fantasy, right? And then if they have a strong preference against one or for one of those two things, that matters, right? Because Barnes and Noble has a fantasy section and has a science fiction section. But beyond that, it doesn't matter
And Jonathan's
quite
just
as
waiting
much,
in the corner,
right?
just glaring at all the people that walk into the fantasy section.
Yeah,
Get this.
you block them. You're like, this way. Good stuff's over here,
Yeah.
dummy. Yeah, but really, besides the basic sort of marketing decision about which shelf it's going to go in the store, I don't think it matters that much. Now, I know any indie writers watching this are going to be screaming, right? What about all these little categories on Amazon? That stuff all matters for the algorithm, for marketability, 100%, right? I think that you, the writer, should figure that out, what you want to call it after you've written it. Just make it the thing that it is. Is Sun Eater cyberpunk? Sometimes, right? Is it gothic literature? Sometimes. Is it a memoir? 100%, right? But is it science fiction? Yes. Fantasy? Yes, right? And then what you want to label it for the algorithm, figure that out later. Don't, I think trying to sort of figure out what the story is for sales purposes, sort of in process, is bad for art. I think you
Mm,
should sort of figure out what you want to do with the thing later, you know. Um, but yeah. So,
for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Science fiction is kind of known as like a genre of rules. Like, you mentioned the boxes, right? But, what I'm getting out of, reading a Blake Crouch techno thriller versus, an absurd Kurt Vonnegut book versus Alistair Reynolds, Dan Simmons, all of these are sort of, tapping into like different things intellectually or emotionally. So it's not one thing. And I think it helps that being true to the story that you want to tell. Like if the story you want to tell just happens to be one thing, you'll be better off following that one thing than trying to get it into, well, this is trending or this is more popular or blah 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 blah. Uh, and it's that, yeah,
yeah, in traditional publishing, right, these are separate questions. The author, so the original model is the author writes a story, right? And whatever the author's thought process for writing the story is what it is. But the author writes the story, delivers it to the agent who sells it to an editor who, let's say, loves it in this case, right? And then how you get that to customers is the problem of the publisher traditionally, right? Now, that's not true in the indie model, and it's decreasingly true even in the traditional model because I have to think about that stuff. Because I am still going to have to do marketing for my own work, right? But I need to sort of those need to be two different Christophers. One Christopher needs to figure out how to sell the book after the other Christopher has written it, and if
mm,
I let the other guy write it, then I stop being an artist. I become a businessman, right? All the way down, right? And the pursuit of art for art's sake, right? I think still matters. And is still how you get the best stories anyway. And so Christopher, the writer, needs to ignore all those marketing considerations in making the story. I wrote these sword and sorcery stories, and I really want to do books, right? And my agent was like, nobody reads sword and sorcery, and I was like, don't call it that then. Say it's an epic fantasy, and everyone will read it, and then I can say later that like I was more motivated by Conan than Aragorn, right, or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. We can just call it what we need to call it, right? As long as it's not a lie, right? It can be like we can sort of you can squish the square peg into the round hole a little bit, but like
yeah.
not maybe not the other way around. And so uh, you know,
Sounds like a good sci-fi story, by the way. We need to clone you. We got Christopher the writer, Christopher the literary manager. What?
Yeah, sure. And but we could also put it on the
This?
satire shelf, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's, is it, it's it's a question of, there are these business concerns that like drive publishing, right? That drive these things. That's really, I think, the essential question about genre. I think the reason we talk about it so much is because nerds love categories. We love taxonomy. We love to figure out which, what kind of newt is this? What kind of Pokemon? What type is it? How many of them are there? Can we put them in? Can they battle each other? Can Goku
That's a
beat
wallaby,
Superman?
not a
Um,
kangaroo.
that's the, totally, yeah, exactly, right. We love that stuff, and so I think that's very appealing to sort of argue: is that really grimdark? What is grimdark, right? And I think artistically and commercially, those are not useful questions. But especially artistically, I think that can get in the way because if I um, if I were to have thought about those questions very seriously, there wasn't like a big science fantasy series in the way that I wanted to write Sun Eater when I started writing Sun Eater. And if I looked at the market and wrote to the market says my thing wasn't viable. Um, and so I wouldn't have done it and I wouldn't be here. Now, of course, people will say, well, there's this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, yeah, but it's a question of time and place and form factor and all these other things. And what I was trying to do wasn't happening at the time. Was happening kind of in fantasy, and all of my comps were really fantasy besides Dune. Early on, all the other titles my publisher was looking at to say this is like that. I'm not saying that like I was a purely original creation, right? Obviously, like I owe a lot to science fiction of the past, but there wasn't anything in exactly its spot at the time, and I had to sort of make a wedge for it to be in the first place. Science fantasy is not something I made up, right? The only reason I call Sun Eater that is because I wanted the hard sci-fi guys to know that it's not that, right?
Hmm.
To try and mitigate that criticism, and to also tell the fantasy people the water is fine, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, and I think it's broadly worked. It's taken a little while to see if that strategy paid off, but here we are. Book 7's out in a couple months, and I hope people like it. So,
Well, you hinted at this earlier, but I'll give you this for the last question. Do
mhm.
you anticipate us moving off, picking our sides, and that kind of being the publishing directing forward, or do you think science fantasy is going to trend upwards? We're going to see this merging continue, and more fantasy series become popular in the future.
I think yes and no. I think right now we're seeing a lot of things. I think in traditional publishing, at least, I think science fiction is suffering a little bit. I do think that there is a bit of a renewed interest in the sort of space opera end of things. I think we might see another new space opera wave in the next decade. Talking to a couple editors who sort of are really, really praying for this. They want it to make a comeback. But they're in a position to have their prayers become reality, force their prayers to become reality. And so we'll see. But fantasy is still the big kid. And we are seeing a lot of sort of romance crossover in fantasy. And so there's a weird sense in which the sort of traditional heroic epic fantasy of Tolkien, right, is also like not really being published at the moment either, because so much of it is going to the sort of romance crossover fantasy, which is fine. I'm not knocking that. But every book that traditional publishing publishes is a book that they don't get to publish, right? They only have so many slots. It's about, it's between 6 and 10 a month, right? That's not a ton for each company, right? And obviously, indie is his whole thing. Everything is happening in indie at every moment in time at maximum volume. But that's a different business. And um, and it certainly is an influential one, but traditional publishing is um, still has an outsized influence over the shape of the understanding of either genre at any given moment, and so these things matter. But I do see more books that are science fantasy that are coming out in recent times. There's a couple I know Dawes Publishing. Can't remember the titles of right now. I should have done my homework. But I know that Dawes doing some as well. And so maybe science fantasy is at a spot where we'll see more of that. And one reason we might see more of it is because that sort of blending is very common in anime and manga and in
Hmm.
video games. And so I think influences from the other media. I talk all the time about the degree to which I'm influenced by video game storytelling, video game world building, and growing up playing, RPGs on the GameCube and the Xbox. And so I think the influence of those other media on literature will continue to be felt as sort of my generation of writers um, comes in and begins telling their stories and continues telling their stories. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, guys, I'm a sci-fi guy. I this would where I should be great if I had a sci-fi is the best fi tattoo to reveal, but I don't have one yet. But I am a sci-fi guy, and the reason why I focus on sci-fi is for two reasons. One, it's just my favorite genre. I am driven to, I'm pulled towards concept-driven stories, and two, I focus on it for the channel because I do feel like sci-fi is the little guy, is the underdog. I feel like there needs to be some more sci-fi channels out there pushing science fiction because there's a lot of great sci-fi out there. But I do also like fantasy in other mediums and even in literature as hybrid genres because some of my favorite series, like Dune, The Dark Tower, Hyperion, and one other one that I can think of. Sun Eater. Get book 1, Empire of Silence, book 7, Shadows Upon Time, coming out in November. Whether you like sci-fi, whether you like fantasy, maybe this is something that can bring us all together, Christopher.
Doing my best. Yeah, thanks for having me on, man.
We appreciate the good work. We appreciate you hanging out. Check out all the links to my stuff, Christopher's stuff. It'll be in the description. And we'll see you on the next one.
Bye, everybody.